I pulled into my daughter's house, warming carrying a homemade blackberry pie while my wife smiled and whispered, "She finally has the home she always dreamed of." My son-in-law welcomed us like the perfect husband, laughing with guests and accepting their compliments. Then my daughter accidentally spilled a glass of water on his shirt. His face twisted with rage, and before anyone could react, he slapped her hard across the face. His mother slowly applauded and said, "That's how a wife learns respect." My daughter grabbed my arm and whispered, "Dad, please don't make this worse. I'm so grateful you're here." The ride out to Derek and Cora's new place was about 40 minutes from our house in Concord. I still carry the memory of the sky that evening, the way October settles over Tennessee and does something particular to the light. It goes amber, slow, the kind of late-day glow that drapes itself over everything and makes the world look gentler, more finished, more certain than it has any right to be. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, where the stories that keep you awake at night are the ones worth telling. If these tales of family betrayal and hard-won truth speak to something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and leave a like. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me, where do you think a story about a daughter in a locked shed might end up? I'd love to hear your instinct. One small note. This story contains fictional elements woven in to serve the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or places is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. Nadine had the blackberry pie dish balanced across her knees the whole drive over, going on about whether Cora had thought to stock up on sturdy paper plates because the ones from her old place would buckle under anything worth eating. I let her talk. My mind was elsewhere back at the closing table 6 weeks prior, where I'd handed Derek Fenwick a white envelope containing a check for $43,000 written in my own hand. 15 years of skimming what I could off an engineer's paycheck. $20 here, $50 there, $100 when a job wrapped up ahead of schedule. Nadine had known about the account all along. Cora had not. That was deliberate. I didn't want her carrying it like a debt. At the closing, Derek gripped my hand and said, "Earl, I don't know what to say." I told him nothing was required. That was the truth of it. A home for my daughter, that was the whole point. The block itself exceeded what I'd pictured. Sidewalks swept clean old oaks standing in rows along the curb. The sort of street where flags hang off front porches and neighbors lift a hand when you pull out of your driveway. The house was a 2-story craftsman with a stone facade, dark green shutters, a wide porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs that still had the tags on them. "Oh, Earl." Nadine breathed it out when the house came into view. Her eyes went glassy the instant she saw it, the way they always did. Didn't matter if it was joy or sorrow. Nadine's eyes never waited for permission. "It's beautiful." "It's a good house," I said. It was the most I had. Cora didn't give us time to reach the door. That's the only way to put it. She didn't come out to meet us. She came through that door like a force of nature, cleared the porch steps in one motion, and got her arms around my neck so hard I rocked back on my heels. The scent hit me rosemary shampoo she'd used since high school. And then that laugh, enormous and unguarded, the one she'd lifted straight from Nadine without ever once acknowledging it. "Dad, oh my God, you're late. I've been watching the driveway for like 20 minutes. Mom, your pie. Yes, perfect. Come in. Come in." Derek just fired up the grill. "Everyone's out back." She seized Nadine's hand and mine simultaneously and marched us toward the front door, like we were small children being shepherded through a fair. That was Cora all over. Whatever room she entered, she owned it. She always had. The inside of the house was humming. Derek's crew from the construction firm. Couples I half recognized from the wedding. Neighbors who'd already made their introductions. New furniture walls freshly rolled and warm gray candles burning along the kitchen island. Music played in the background. A playlist drifted between Americana and soft jazz. The volume set high enough to give the room some life, but low enough to talk over. Roberta Fenwick had positioned herself near the fireplace. Earl, Nadine. She moved toward us and enclosed Nadine's hand in both of hers, that double grip hold that puts me in mind of politicians working a rope line, or funeral directors at the door. "So wonderful to have you here. This house wouldn't exist without your generosity. We're just happy they found something they love." Nadine meant every syllable the way she always did. Roberta's smile stayed in place, but behind it, her gaze traveled hairline to shoes, back up again measuring cataloging. I clocked it, said nothing, kept my face neutral. The party found its rhythm the way these things do when they're going well. Food arrived in waves, drinks made the rounds, laughter broke out over stories I couldn't quite follow. Derek ran the backyard like a man born to it. He carried himself with that particular ease, a handshake calibrated to exactly the right duration. A laugh that surfaced at precisely the right beat the ability to surface your name, your profession, and your connection to him within the first 30 seconds of conversation, as if he'd been rehearsing. People were his element. That had always been apparent. Cora drifted through the crowd with a tray of appetizers deep in hostess mode, color in her cheeks on what I estimated was her second glass of wine. She found my face from across the room and gave me that lopsided grin slightly too wide, the one that collapsed her age entirely and made her look the way she had at 7. Something shifted in my chest, pride or the nearest thing to it. Then it was over. Cora pushed through the back door with a large serving dish roasted vegetables. I believe the kind of load that demands both hands. She was mid-sentence with someone, behind her head turned, not watching her footing, and her shoe caught the lip of the patio mat. She kept her balance, but the dish pitched and the glass of ice water perched on the corner of the outdoor table toppled straight down the front of Derek's shirt. The talk around us didn't die. It snagged that brief collective stutter when a room senses something has shifted and pauses to assess. Cora wheeled around, her expression already dissolving into apology. "Derek, I'm so sorry I didn't let me get a towel." Derek glanced down at his shirt. Then his eyes came back up to Cora. Nothing crossed his face. That detail is what stays with me most. Not a flash of temper, not the wince of embarrassment, not even mild annoyance. A blankness settled over him, smooth and complete like a curtain dropping. He raised his hand, placed it against Cora's cheek, and slapped her. Not with enough force to send her stumbling, with enough force that the sound reached every corner of that patio, with enough force that her head swung with it. Every conversation died at once. To my left, Roberta Fenwick raised both hands and brought them together, 3 slow, deliberate claps. The kind you'd give a mediocre performance you feel obligated to acknowledge. "That's how you keep a house in order," she remarked pleasantly and lifted her wine. I was standing. I hadn't chosen to stand. My legs resolved the matter before my mind weighed in the body's version of flinching at a sudden crack of sound. Nadine's hand landed on my forearm. Her grip was something to reckon with for a 61-year-old woman who'd spent 30 years in a second-grade classroom. Not a word from her, just that hold. Cora stood motionless, palm flat against her cheek eyes, cast down toward the stone beneath her feet. "Cora." My voice dropped lower than I meant it to, rougher at the edges. She raised her head. Her eyes were bright with tears that hadn't broken yet. She was keeping them there through what appeared to be sheer practiced effort, the kind of restraint that doesn't come from willpower alone. "Dad, it's fine." Her voice didn't waver. That was the most alarming part. "We're fine. It was an accident. Just a little argument. Please." That last word found a spot just behind my ribs and lodged there. I lowered myself back into my seat. My hand pressed hard against my knee beneath the table. I focused on the sensation, let it ground me. Bit by bit, the conversation around us resumed, tentative, subdued people finding sudden interest in their food, their glasses, anything that wasn't Derek or Cora or the two of us. Roberta topped off her wine. The drive back took 40 minutes, same as it always did, but the distance felt greater. Nadine cradled the empty pie dish in her lap, not a crumb left, which on any ordinary evening would have pleased her, no end. She kept her face turned toward the dark window and the highway sliding past. I missed our usual turn without noticing. An old reflex, the long route when something needed thinking through. We reached the Edmondson and Harding intersection, the 4-way stop. We'd rolled through 1,000 times across 22 years. Nadine turned away from the glass. "Earl." One word. My name and nothing else. 2 syllables she'd worn smooth over 40 years of marriage and 10,000 repetitions. But the weight behind it tonight was entirely different. It settled into the car like something physical, like a presence occupying the back seat. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. She was thinking what I was thinking, and we both knew it, and neither of us had a way forward yet. The coffee had gone stone cold at my elbow. 3 days past the housewarming, and the kitchen held a silence it didn't usually carry. Nadine was still in bed, waking later than her norm, which told me everything. She wasn't resting. She was enduring the early hours until the alarm made it acceptable to rise. That was what she did when something was gnawing at her that hadn't yet found its words. I'd been up since 5, made coffee, sat with it, and watched the yard pass through its gradations, black, then gray, then the washed-out gold that October lays across Tennessee in the early morning. A half-written list of garden tasks sat on the table in front of me, untouched. The truth was that the same 40 seconds had been looping in my head for 72 hours straight. The dish going sideways, the water landing, that blankness descending over Derek's face, the sound of the slap, Roberta's measured applause. I kept reaching for a frame that would make it manageable. A man pushed past his limit. One bad moment uglier on the surface than it was underneath. I'd constructed whole frameworks of explanation, torn them apart, and started over the way I used to work through rough site plans at 2 in the morning, before a deadline, hunting for the version that held together without gutting everything already built. Nadine came in at 7:15, hair still loose, wearing the old blue cardigan she'd had since before Cora was born. She poured herself coffee and took the seat across from me without a good morning. "I want to call her," she said. "I know Earl. Give her a couple more days. If we call now, she'll spend the whole conversation managing us instead of talking to us." Nadine wrapped both hands around her mug and stared into it like she was reading something there. She pressed her hand against her cheek, she said, like it wasn't the first time she'd known how to do that. The words settled in my gut like a swallow of cold water. "Nadine, I'm not saying anything. I'm just telling you what I saw." We sat in that for a while. Outside, a cardinal touched down on the bird feeder I'd assembled from a kit Cora gave me for Father's Day when she was 12. It was still standing, which was more than I'd counted on from a 12-year-old's kit. The phone rang at 9:47, Cora's name on the screen. Nadine's hand moved toward it, first then stopped, and she looked at me. I picked up. "Hey, sweetheart. Dad?" Her voice was bright easy, the spoken version of an uncluttered room. "I'm so sorry I haven't called sooner. It's been completely insane over here. Derek had 3 site visits yesterday, and I've been trying to get the kitchen actually functional." "Cora," I kept my voice level. "How are you?" "Good, really good. Actually, I wanted to call because Derek feels terrible about what happened at the party." A small pause, carefully placed. He'd been dealing with a nightmare situation with a contractor all week, and he just, it wasn't okay, and he knows that, and he wanted me to tell you both that he's sorry you had to see that. I noticed she said, "Derek was sorry, you had to see it." Not Derek was sorry, he did it. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Dad, yes, I promise." We talked it all out. It was a stressful night, and things got out of hand. It happens. Another pause and then a laugh light practiced. "You know me. I'm not exactly easy to live with either." Something pulled tight behind my eyes. "Cora." My grip tightened on the phone. "Are you safe?" A full 2 seconds of silence. Then, "Dad, come on. You're being dramatic. I'm fine. Derek would never actually hurt me. That's not what this is." Her words had taken on a careful quality, each one placed the way you place a foot on uncertain ground. "Please don't make this into something it isn't. I really need you guys to trust us." "We trust you," I said, because that was the only part of it that was true. After we hung up, Nadine looked across the table at me. "She said he'd never actually hurt her," I told her. Nadine's jaw tightened. She got up, went to the counter, and began washing a dish that didn't need washing. "People who've never been hurt don't need to use the word. Actually," she said almost to herself. I had nothing to offer that. I called Brent Aldwell that afternoon. We'd been friends since we both worked the Riverfront Municipal Project back in 1997, back when Brent was still practicing contract law, before he moved into criminal defense. I wasn't entirely sure why I called him over anyone else. Maybe because Brent was the type who let you get through the whole story before he opened his mouth. I laid it all out for him. The water glass, the slap, Roberta's applause, Cora's voice on the phone that morning. Brent stayed quiet for a long beat after I finished. "Do you have anything documented?" he asked. "Photos, recordings, anything written down?" "No." "Has Cora said anything to anyone? A doctor, a friend, any official channel?" "Not that I know of." "Earl." Brent's voice went careful, the register it found, when he was about to deliver something he knew I wasn't ready for. Without something concrete, there's very little anyone can do. "What you witnessed, it's terrible, and I believe you, and I'm sorry. But a single incident at a private gathering, where the only witnesses are guests who may or may not back you up, and where your daughter is actively saying nothing, happened." "I know," I said. "Keep watching," he said. "Write down anything you can, and if she ever says something to you, anything at all, put it on paper right away. Date, time, exact words." I thanked him and ended the call. Nadine was in the living room when I came out of my office. She had pulled 3 photo albums from the bottom shelf, The big ones, the ones going all the way back to when Cora was born, and spread them open across the coffee table. She was leaning forward, elbows on her knees, studying a photo of Cora at maybe 9 or 10, laughing at something beyond the frame, gap-toothed and sunburned and entirely herself. She never backed down from anything Nadine said without looking up. Remember when she wrote that letter to the school board about the broken water fountains in the gym? She was 13. She made me proofread it 4 times. I remember. She stood in the kitchen and read it out loud to practice. Wouldn't stop until she could get through the whole thing without her voice shaking. I sat beside Nadine and looked at the photograph. The girl in it stood with both feet planted like the ground belonged to her. The girl on the phone that morning had said, "Please." I turned away from the albums before Nadine could see what my face was doing. That night I sat in the armchair after Nadine went to bed and thought about the wedding. 14 months earlier, a Saturday in August, the reception at a venue outside Knoxville, paper lanterns, and a live band playing too loud. I danced with Cora to a song she'd picked that I pretended not to like and liked immediately. At the end of the evening, I'd shaken Derek's hand. He'd held up the white envelope and said, "Earl, seriously, I don't have words." And I'd looked at his face in that moment, really looked, and caught something that hadn't read right. Something moving beneath the gratitude at a different frequency. Not warmth, calculation. The look of a man quietly running numbers. I'd let it go. Put it down to the emotion of the day, my own nerves. 2 glasses of champagne on a system that didn't handle champagne well. Sitting in the armchair at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, I stopped letting it go. The following Thursday, I stayed near the phone from the 30 onward. Cora had called every Thursday evening at 8 o'clock since the week she left for college. Not by agreement, it had simply become the shape of things. 10 or 15 minutes of whatever was on her mind. The most dependable fixture in my week for over a decade. 8 o'clock came and passed. 8:15, 8:30. I shut the television off at 9 and went to bed. 2 weeks went by. Then the month turned, and on a Wednesday morning in November, my phone rang while I was working the garden beds out back. Hands dirty, knees aching. Cora's name on the screen. I stripped off one glove and answered. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the Thursday calls. She said she needed to ask a favor. Derek had a cash flow problem on a project temporary, she said. They'd pay it back? She hated to ask, but I stood in the yard with cold earth on my hands and listened to my daughter's voice and tried as hard as I could to tell whether it was still really her underneath it. January arrived with teeth that year, the bone-deep kind of cold that moves into an old house and refuses to leave. Pipes groaning through the night frost on the inside of the garage windows. The garden beds gone colorless and brittle under a sky that hadn't shown real sun in 2 weeks. I was in the back reinforcing a stretch of fence that had started leaning after the November rains, hands raw from the cold, when I heard a car pull into the drive. I knew the sound of Cora's car. She'd driven that same secondhand Corolla since she was 23, and the engine ticked on the downshift in a way I'd mentioned 3 times, and she'd ignored every time. I set down the hammer and came around the side of the house. She was moving up the front walk, shoulders drawn in against the cold, wearing a coat I didn't recognize, dark-fitted, nothing like what she used to reach for. She glanced up when she heard my boots on the path and smiled. "Hey, Dad. Hey, yourself." I pulled her into a hug. She felt thinner than I remembered. "Why didn't you call ahead? I was in the neighborhood and I needed to talk to you guys about something." Nadine had heard the car too. She appeared at the door, still gripping a dish towel, and the way her whole face opened when she saw Cora made something constrict in my chest. We hadn't laid eyes on her since the housewarming. 3 months. Nadine cooked because that was how she handled feelings she couldn't otherwise place. Chicken and dumplings, the sweet potato casserole Cora had loved since she was a kid. Cora sat at the kitchen table and talked about the neighborhood, about a restaurant Derek liked, about some renovation they were thinking through for the backyard. She talked a great deal. I noticed she talked about Derek the way you talk about the weather, constantly present, impossible to leave out of any sentence just there. The money part surfaced at the end of the meal. The plumbing situation turned out to be bigger than the inspector caught. She said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. There's a whole section of pipe under the foundation that has to come out. Derek got 3 estimates, and every one of them is brutal. She named a figure. It was significant. I didn't react. "Of course," I said. "We'll transfer it Monday." Cora's shoulders dropped, perhaps half an inch relief she hadn't known she was carrying. "Thank you, Dad. I hate asking." "You're not asking for yourself," Nadine said, her voice firm. "You're asking for your home. That's different." Cora left an hour later. Derek was waiting. She hugged us both. At the door, said she'd call soon, and was gone before it occurred to either of us to ask her to stay. Looking back, I can see now what Derek had been orchestrating in the months leading up to the change. Cora's old colleagues stopped hearing from her. Friends from college got one-line replies that eventually became no replies at all. By the time Lucinda Pruitt entered her life, there was almost no one left who saw Cora often enough to notice that something was different. 2 weeks passed. Then she was back. This time, something had changed. I stood in the doorway and tried to put my finger on exactly what it was, and couldn't. It wasn't her hair. It wasn't her makeup. It wasn't how she held herself. It was something deeper. The line of her jaw, the angle of her nose. Small things, the kind you'd write off as a trick of winter light if you saw her in passing. But I had been looking at that face for 28 years. Over lunch, Nadine reached across the table and tilted Cora's chin gently toward the window. "Honey," she said, "did you do something your face looks?" "I had a little work done." Cora pulled back with a smile that arrived half a beat too late. "Just some contouring stuff filler, a little refinement on the bridge. It's very common, Mom. Half the women in Derek's social circle have had something." "Why didn't you tell us?" Nadine asked. "Because it's my face." Cora's voice carried an edge that was almost recognizable, almost the sharpness she'd always had. "I'm allowed to make decisions about my own face without a family meeting." Nadine nodded and let it alone, but her eyes kept returning to Cora's profile throughout the rest of the meal, moving in small, careful arcs. "The way you examine a word you almost recognize in a language you don't quite speak." The second visit was about investment. Derek had an opportunity, a commercial development project, with a strong return profile. Some partners he trusted a narrow window to get in early. She laid it out efficiently, fluently, the way someone presents information they've been prepared on. I asked 2 or 3 questions. The answers came back polished, slightly too complete. I wrote the check. Early February brought a third visit. Nadine was at her book club, so it was just the 2 of us. Cora came in and unwound her scarf, settled at the kitchen table. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. Then she said Derek had found another opportunity. Private equity, very selective, needed to move fast. "What's it for?" I asked. She blinked. "I just said private equity. Dad, real estate adjacent. Derek has been watching this group for—" "I heard what you said." I kept my voice, even hands flat on the table. "I'm asking what the money is specifically going toward. Where does it land? Who manages it? What's the structure?" Something moved across her face there and gone in under a second, a tightening around the eyes like a door being quietly closed. Then the smile returned, open and easy. "You know Derek doesn't love it when I share confidential deal details," she said lightly. "It's a trust thing with his partners." "But, Dad, seriously, we wouldn't be asking if it wasn't solid." I looked at her. She looked back at me with her daughter's eyes and her daughter's smile, and something underneath that belonged to neither. "Let me think about it," I said. She left 20 minutes later with nothing. Nadine came home to find me at the table with a cup of cold coffee. "She was here," I said. It wasn't a question. 3rd time this month. Nadine set down her bag and studied me. What did she want? I told her. Nadine listened without sitting, arms, folded, jaw set. "Earl," she said, and stopped. "What?" "This morning when she came in, did you watch her pour herself coffee?" I thought back. Cora had walked straight to the counter, pulled a mug from the cabinet, filled it from the pot without breaking stride. Drank half of it standing there. "She always does that," I said. Nadine shook her head, slow and deliberate. "Earl, Cora hasn't been able to drink coffee since she was 16. Her heart races. She got dizzy at prom. The doctor told her to cut it out entirely." She pressed her lips together. "She hasn't touched the stuff in 12 years. I've watched her decline it 100 times. I stared at my wife. Nadine's voice was perfectly level when she said, "That girl drank a full mug of black coffee this morning and didn't even blink." March arrived, and the temperature began climbing back towards something bearable. Nadine and I had barely addressed directly what she'd noticed. We'd been circling it for weeks, moving in and then pulling back the way you orbit something you aren't ready to put your hands on. Then Derek called. He wanted to have us over for dinner. His idea, he said. He'd cook nothing elaborate, just a chance to reconnect. He felt bad that things had been strained. His voice on the phone was warm and self-deprecating, calibrated to the last degree. I hung up and stood in the hallway holding the phone. "Derek wants to have us over," I told Nadine. She was quiet for a moment. "Are we going?" "Yes," I said. We're going to sit there and eat whatever he puts on the table and smile, and I'm going to watch every single thing that happens in that house. Nadine held my gaze for a long moment. Okay, Earl, she said. Okay? The house felt different when we walked in. The tension that had occupied every corner on the night of the housewarming had been replaced by something that looked on the surface like the precise opposite. Music on the speakers, soft, familiar, candles on the dining table. Derek in the kitchen, wearing an apron that looked fresh out of the packaging, stirring something that smelled genuinely good. Earl Nadine. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and gripped my hand with both of his, then pulled Nadine into a hug the way old friends do. So glad you're here. Cora's just getting changed. Roberta's coming too. Hope that's all right. Roberta arrived 10 minutes later with a bottle of red wine she passed to Nadine. You look wonderful, she told Nadine, with that particular smile that never reached the outer edges of her eyes. Cora came downstairs in a blue dress I didn't recognize. She crossed the room and hugged Nadine and said, Mom, I'm so glad you're here. The pronunciation was right. The warmth was right. Nadine hugged her back, and I watched Nadine's face over Cora's shoulder, watched the way her expression stayed just a fraction too controlled. Dinner was good. Derek had made beef brisket, roasted potatoes, a salad with those little croutons Nadine liked. Roberta poured the wine. The conversation moved through safe, pleasant ground neighborhood news, a home improvement project Derek had in mind, a documentary Roberta had seen. Cora sat across from me. She laughed at the right moments. She asked Nadine about her book club. She topped up water glasses without being prompted. Everything correct, everything on cue. I watched her cover her mouth when she laughed. Right hand. I looked down at my plate and told myself I was remembering wrong. Cora had always, but had she. Right hand. Left hand. I couldn't be certain of anything anymore. And uncertainty was a door Derek and Roberta were very comfortable leaving open. Second course brought the quiche Derek had assembled as a side dish cut into wedges. Cora lifted a piece onto her plate, worked her fork through it, and finished the whole thing, dent center and all, at a steady, unhurried pace, wearing the expression of someone for whom eggs had never been anything but ordinary. I felt Nadine go rigid beside me. I put my fork down, reached for my wine glass, pulled a slow breath in through my nose. When dessert was done, I asked to be excused and stepped outside. The back patio was cool and dark, the March air carrying a bite. I stood with my hands deep in my coat pockets and took stock of the yard. A security light cast the garage in flat white. Bare beds where nothing had come up yet. A gas grill tarped and sitting idle, and at the far end, tucked against the fence, a storage shed behind a padlock. The wood framing around the door was noticeably fresher than the rest of the structure, replaced recently or reinforced. 4 decades of looking at how things are built will train that into you whether you want it or not. I studied it for a moment. Then Derek's voice came from behind the screen door offering coffee, and I turned and went in. Farewells happened on the front porch. Roberta pressed her cheek to Nadine's. Derek worked my hand with both of his. Same grip as always. Cora got her arms around each of us and said we ought to make this a monthly thing. Nadine and I walked to the car together. Clear night, cold, moving in fast. I already had the key fob out when we reached the curve at the bottom of the driveway where the hedge bent toward the sidewalk. A boy was standing on the other side of it, 10 years old, give or take, slim, dark hoodie, white sneakers. He hadn't flinched at our approach. He carried the stillness of someone who'd been there a while and intended to be there a while longer. His gaze came straight to mine level and unreadable in a way you don't often see on a face that young. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you her parents, the lady in that house?" Nadine's hand came around my arm. "We're her family," I said. "Yes." "Who are you, son?" He looked once over his shoulder at the house, then back at me, and what came out of his mouth next emptied the air right out of me. He was maybe 10 at the outside, slight kid hoodie zipped all the way up, sneakers worn down at the heel. He stood right at the spot where the hedge curved and the pavement met, and there was nothing nervous about him, no shifting foot to foot, no scanning the street. He'd planted himself there and made his peace with it. His eyes hadn't left mine. Grave eyes, eyes that had been carrying something. "That lady in there," he said, and tilted his chin toward the house. "Isn't your daughter? She's not the same person." It landed like stepping off a curb. You didn't see a jolt that travels the whole body before the mind can name what happened. Nadine's grip on my forearm went tight enough that I felt each knuckle separately. I bent my knees and got myself down closer to his height. Cold weather doesn't do my joints any favors, but I wasn't thinking about that. Son, I said, and kept my voice as steady as I could manage. What's your name? Kofi. Clean no hesitation. Kofi, where do you live? He lifted a hand and pointed the house directly adjoining Derek and Cora's, smaller sage green siding, a wind chime working slowly in the March air. Then those same steady eyes came back to me. My mom told me to stay out of it, he said, but I kept thinking about it. A glance at Nadine, then back. You needed to know. And before there was anything left to say, he pivoted and headed back up toward his front door, hands tucked in the center pocket pace. Deliberate, unhurried, the walk of a kid who has done the thing he set out to do and needs nothing further from you. Nadine and I stood on the sidewalk and didn't move until he was inside. Earl, Nadine's voice. He's a child. It came out harder than I'd planned. Children say things. He picks something up through a wall, or he's got a story running in his head, or I clicked the fob and the locks popped. Let's get home. Nadine didn't push back. She settled into the passenger seat and fixed her eyes on the road ahead, while I got the car moving, and we covered the 40 minutes home with nothing on the radio and very little between us. Somewhere along I-85, Nadine drew breath like she was about to speak, then didn't. I held the wheel with both hands and ran the same loop in my head that you run when you need the math to come out differently. He's 10 years old. He doesn't know anything. Kids read situations wrong constantly. We turned into the driveway, and I had nearly talked myself into it. Nadine went up to bed at 10. I said I'd follow shortly. I didn't. I stayed in the armchair with the lamp dark and the phone face up in my hand, the glow of the screen, the only light in the room. I pulled up the wedding photos, the digital files from the photographer. 843 shots from that Saturday in August, 14 months back. I paged through the ones of Cora's face, the close shots. The ones where something funny had just happened, and the ones where she'd gone quiet, and the one where she was dancing with her back to the lens and didn't know anyone was watching. I sat with them for a long time. Then I tried to set that face next to the one I'd looked at across the dinner table that evening. The angle of the jaw, the way a laugh started in the eyes before it reached the mouth, the line of the nose in candlelight. I pressed my thumb and forefinger into the bridge of my own nose and held until the pressure registered. I couldn't call them different. I couldn't call them the same. 28 years of fatherhood. This face, since it was new and crumpled and still streaked from the delivery, and I could not be certain. That was the part that put the weight on my chest. The kind of weight that doesn't come from one direction. I set the phone on the side table and looked at the ceiling. The Thursday calls. That thought surfaced without invitation and sat me up. Every Thursday at 8:00 since Cora left for college at 18. 10 years of it. Rain finals, holidays, none of it changed the rhythm. She called. We'd cover whatever was on her mind. I made a show of not needing it and needed it completely, and she understood that without either of us ever naming it. I worked backward through the calendar. The wedding was August 2021. That was, I did the math, slowly, deliberately, 31 Thursdays ago. 31 evenings at 8 o'clock. My phone had been silent every one of them. I had reasoned it away newlywed adjustment schedules, shifting the idea that a grown daughter didn't owe her father a weekly call. I'd assembled that argument brick by brick and inhabited it for 7 months without once checking whether it held weight. In the dark at 11:40 on a Tuesday, I pressed my palm flat to my sternum and felt my own pulse and recognized that it had never held weight. I'd only been too frightened to find that out. The next Monday I was in the kitchen when a car pulled up, and Nadine answered the front door. 2 voices reached me from the hall, Nadine's measured warm. The other one, bright a little too rehearsed. I stayed at the counter. After a few minutes, I heard Nadine ask something in the pleasant offhand register she uses precisely when she is not being offhand. An answer came back. Then the door closed. Nadine came through to the kitchen. Something had happened to the color in her face. Not pallor, not exactly. More like whatever keeps the blood near the surface had decided to withdraw. Mittens, she said. I put down my mug. What? I asked her about the cat. The one Cora had in 6th grade. Nadine's delivery was stripped of everything. I asked what she named it. I already had the answer before she spoke, the way you carry the ending of a thing you've been afraid to reach. Biscuit, I said quietly. She named it Biscuit. Nadine gave one nod. She said Mittens. No hesitation. Didn't search for it at all. The rooms felt compressed after that. Like something structural had shifted 2 inches inward while my attention was elsewhere. Nadine stood in the hallway, hands still resting on the door handle, shoulders drawn up in a way I hadn't seen since her mother's worst year. I came around the island and positioned myself close enough for her to register I was there. Nadine. She turned. The rims of her eyes were red, but there were no tears. Nadine was the kind of woman who wept at graduations and surprise parties, not at the hard moments. The cat, she told me, was named Biscuit, her voice splitting on that word. Cora had chosen the name herself. She'd walked through the front door with that animal tucked inside a shoebox and informed every person in the house that Biscuit was his name on account of the color of him. 11 years old Earl. I was standing right there. I know exactly what happened. Something thick settled in my throat. That same girl had said mittens without so much as a flicker. Nadine held the back of her hand to her mouth for a beat. Then she composed herself, drew her old blue cardigan she'd had since before Cora was born, tighter across her chest, and moved past me toward the living room. Get the albums out. We laid all three across the coffee table, the oversized ones, with the plastic sleeves dates written by hand along the spines. Nadine had tended those albums with real care, one photo to a sleeve, a caption in blue ink on the reverse of each. We worked through them the way you'd excavate something fragile, no hurry, nothing skipped. Nadine lifted a photo of Cora at maybe 17, caught mid-laugh at something beyond the frame. Right here, she said, tracing a finger along the jaw, where it meets the ear. I studied the image. Then my mind went back to the woman at our table the previous evening, the candle throwing light across her face. I crossed to the kitchen and dug through the drawer where I filed household papers, found the February delivery receipt, the grocery order that arrived while we were visiting the one she'd put her name to. Her signature occupied the lower right corner, rounded vertical letters that tilted gently rightward. Then I pulled the wedding folder from the cabinet in my office. The venue contract, the photographer's invoice, the marriage license, and there was Cora's name on the catering agreement. We'd helped them book small and compressed every letter, leaning decisively to the left. I carried both documents to the living room and placed them on the coffee table one beside the other. Nadine studied them, her lips pressed so tight the color drained right out of them. She rose to her feet in a single sharp movement, walked to the window, and stood there, arms wrapped around herself. Eyes on the street, her back turned to me, to the table, to the thing those papers were telling us. "I'm calling Brent," I said. He answered on the second ring. I laid it all out, the coffee, the cat's name, the two signatures, the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in my chest since a 10-year-old child told me the woman living under my daughter's roof was not my daughter. I described the face that was close but off by something I couldn't name. The Thursday calls that had simply stopped the week the wedding ended. Brent held his silence longer than I expected. "Earl," he said, choosing his words, "you're telling me you think someone replaced your daughter. I'm telling you, I need to find out. I'm not making accusations. I'm telling you what I have and asking you what to do with it." A long pause followed. I could almost hear the gears turning. Brent got quiet like that whenever he was thinking something through carefully. "The signatures are the hardest evidence you've got right now. Everything behavioral is softer, harder to anchor to anything formal." He let out a slow breath. "There's a man I know retired from the force private investigator for roughly 8 years now. Careful worker, knows how to build a picture that'll hold up. His name is Clifford Drayton. I'll contact him today." After the call ended, I stayed in the hallway, phone pressed flat against my sternum. Then I made my way to Cora's room. Nadine hadn't touched a single thing in it since the day Cora packed up and left. We'd talked once or twice about turning it into a guest room and never followed through. Standing there, I understood why. Nadine had known the way mothers carry a knowing they can't quite put into language that she wasn't finished with it yet. The poster Cora had brought home from a street fair at 16 still hung on the wall, a print of a painting she'd been drawn to without ever being able to say exactly why. The tin of colored pencils sat on the desk where she'd left it. The quilt across the bed was one Nadine's mother had sewn. I lowered myself onto the mattress edge. On the shelf above the desk, wedged between old sketchbooks and a ceramic mug, bristling with dried-out pens, sat a small wooden box of my own making. Walnut simple joinery, a copper latch on the front. I'd put it together in the garage when Cora was 4, and every year after that, I'd added something to it. I set it across my knees and worked the latch open. 28 cards, one per birthday, each drawn by hand with whatever I could find, pencils, markers, whatever was in reach. No one would ever mistake me for an artist, and I never claimed otherwise, but Cora had loved them all the same, or told me she did. After a while, I quit asking myself whether she meant it and just kept on, because those cards were the one gift I could offer that was mine alone to give. The first, a lopsided orange cat whiskers slightly off-center crayon on construction paper. The fifth, a bicycle for the year. She finally got her balance. The 16th, a guitar, because she'd wanted lessons practiced hard for 3 weeks, then moved on, and I'd loved her equally for the wanting and the letting go. The 28th, 2 hands rendered more slowly and deliberately than anything I'd drawn before stretching toward each other from opposite corners of the page. I'd slipped it into the pocket of her dress bag on the morning of the wedding. She'd rung me from the bridal suite 40 minutes later, voice coming apart, and I'd had to clear my throat 3 times before a single word would come out. I sat on her bed with that box open across my knees and moved through 28 years. The Thursdays, the birthdays, the unremarkable Tuesday nights, until my eyes burned enough that I had to shut them. The following morning, I found Clifford Drayton waiting for me at a diner just off Nolensville Pike. He'd taken a booth before I arrived, mid-50s silver, at the Temples, the face of a man who had logged enough mileage that surprise no longer registered. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. A yellow legal pad lay blank beside it. I set the 2 signature samples on the table between us. He examined them without picking them up. Then his eyes came up to meet mine. "Before Derek Fenwick married your daughter," he said, "did he have a girlfriend?" The question hit like a stone thrown into still water. Every assumption I'd organized my thinking around rippled outward and shifted. "Not that I know of," I told him. "Why?" Clifford glanced back at the signatures, then returned to my face. Nothing moved in his expression, but something in his gaze locked in, sharpened in a way that sent a chill straight up the back of my neck. Because he said, measured and slow, "I think I know what I'm looking for now." The block where Clifford ran his office was the sort of Nashville neighborhood that had been mid-renovation for 2 decades and never quite crossed the finish line. Fresh awnings on brick storefronts sharing a block with buildings that hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 90s. A barber shop, a craft brewery, a tax office with a sign, lettered by hand in the window. Clifford's space sat between a dry cleaner and a locksmith. Drayton Investigative Services, the door said in plain black letters. No flourishes. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes before I went inside. The office ran small, a desk, a pair of client chairs, a filing cabinet, a window overlooking a blank brick wall. Clifford was already at his desk when I entered a folder spread open before him. The yellow legal pad dense with notes I couldn't decipher from where I stood. He looked up when I walked in and pointed me to the chair. "I'll start with Derek," he said. Nothing before it. I found that I appreciated the directness. He spun the legal pad so the top section faced me. Columns of figures, dates, the names of institutions. Derek Fenwick's finances are considerably worse than whatever the public record shows. He's structured things carefully. LLC layers assets titled under his mother's name. The whole arrangement reads as legitimate right up until you begin pulling at it. Clifford tapped the pad with his pen. 5 years, 3 construction projects, 2 collapsed entirely. The third is still nominally open, but has never produced a return. His total exposure, 2 private lenders, plus a commercial credit line that went into default back in 2020, sits at roughly $400,000. That figure settled somewhere low in my abdomen. $400,000. I thought of the $43,000 I'd signed over on that check and felt a particular kind of stupid, the slow, heavy kind. And before Cora, I said, "You found something." Clifford reached into the folder and drew out a photograph, a standard print pulled from a digital file, and turned it to face me on the desk. "Her name is Lucinda Pruitt," he said. 4 years with Derek. They met at Vanderbilt University. The relationship ended approximately 8 months before Derek came into your daughter's life. I picked up the photograph. My hands started shaking before my mind had fully caught up to what my eyes were seeing. Not a tremor, something more specific than that. An involuntary current that began in my fingers and traveled up through my wrist. The woman in that photograph carried Cora's cheekbones. Cora's jawline, that same slight upward tilt at the outer corners of the eyes. Not a perfect match. The nose diverged. The proportions were a fraction off, but the underlying structure, the bone architecture of the face, was close enough that a stranger looking at both women might genuinely wonder if they shared blood. "How did Derek find Cora?" I asked. My voice held steadier than I had any right to expect. "Social media, most likely." Your daughter kept a public profile, her work, her projects. Derek would have come across her photographs. Clifford drew out a second image and laid it next to the first. This is Lucinda, approximately 4 months ago. I studied the second photograph. The nose had changed. The jawline had been refined. The cheekbones sat at a subtly different angle. The resemblance to the first image was still readable. Same eyes, the same foundational structure, but something had been added, something corrected. The way a rough sketch gets worked into a finished drawing. The resemblance to Cora was no longer approximate. It was precise. She had work done, I said. Multiple procedures. I found records from a private cosmetic surgery practice in Huntsville, Alabama, cash payments, which is unusual for elective procedures of this scale. Financing or insurance is the norm. Someone didn't want a paper trail connecting back to a name. Clifford placed a third sheet on the desk, a printout of what appeared to be an appointment log, identifying details redacted except for dates and procedure types. The timing lines up with the 6 months before your daughter's wedding. I set down Lucinda's before photograph. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the photo I'd brought a copy of Cora's wedding portrait printed that morning. I positioned it between the 2 images of Lucinda, 3 photographs in a row on the desk. I looked at them for a long time without saying a word. Clifford didn't push me. A truck rumbled past outside on the street, and then it was quiet again. They planned this before the wedding. I said it the way you state a fact you wish weren't true. No question, no accusation, just the only sentence that accounted for what was in front of me. Clifford gave a slow nod. Long before. The surgery timeline alone puts the planning at a minimum of 6 months pre-wedding, possibly earlier, depending on when Derek first identified your daughter as a target. The word target passed through me like ice water poured down the back of my neck. My daughter, my Cora, identified as a target. I pressed both palms flat against the desk and breathed steadily through my nose. You said there was something else, I told him. Last week you said you needed a few more days. I do. Clifford closed the folder. I want to be certain before I put it in front of you. Give me until Friday. I drove home with all 3 photographs lying face down on the passenger seat because I'd discovered I couldn't look at them while moving without my hands becoming unreliable. That evening at 7:43, my cell phone rang. Cora's name on the screen, the contact I hadn't been able to bring myself to change. Dad. The voice was warm and easy, calibrated to exactly the right frequency. How are you guys? It feels like forever since we talked. We're good, I said. How are you? Amazing. Derek has actually been really great lately. That's why I'm calling. He wants to have you both over again, maybe next Saturday. He's been talking about trying a new recipe. That sounds fine, I said. We'll be there. Perfect. I'll text Mom the details. Love you, Dad. Love you too, I said. The line went dead. I stayed in my armchair with the phone in my lap. The photographs face down on the end table beside me and stared at the wall. I held the particular coldness of a man who has just said I love you to someone who was not his daughter. Nadine never told me precisely when she decided to do it on her own. I think she'd been turning it over for a while quietly, the way Nadine handled most things that actually mattered to her. She mentioned it to me one evening, almost as an aside, the way you might mention you've already started dinner. I'm going to ask her to coffee, just the 2 of us. No Derek. I looked up from my paper. When I already did Wednesday morning. She said yes. That was Nadine. 30 years in a 2nd grade classroom teaches you that people reveal themselves most fully when they believe no one is taking careful note. She'd been putting that understanding to work on children since 1992. She turned it on, the woman living inside our daughter's life. She told me everything afterward, sitting at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she was talking. They met at a cafe on Hillsborough Pike neutral ground, Nadine's idea. Lucinda was already seated when Nadine walked in, which Nadine registered immediately. She got there first. Nadine told me she'd wanted to be settled to control the seat placement, the feel of the light. She'd spent enough years with children to recognize the behavior of someone who came prepared. The coffee arrived. Nadine watched Lucinda lift her mug with her right hand, watched her cover her mouth with her right hand when she laughed at something Nadine said. For 28 years, Nadine had watched Cora cover her mouth with her left hand, had watched it so many times it had become part of the grammar of knowing her daughter's face. Nadine filed that away and kept going. I asked about the 4th of July, Nadine told me, the year she was 9. The The summer we went to Gulf Shores and she got stung by a jellyfish and cried for 40 minutes and then ate 2 ice cream cones and announced it was the best day of her life. Nadine paused. She said she remembered it. She described the beach, the fireworks, the ice cream, every detail accurate. But Nadine's voice went tight as she told me she described it from outside herself, like she was reading from a report. Cora always talked about that trip by saying, "I was so dramatic, oh my God, Mom." She mocked herself. This one simply narrated it. Nadine had brought a photograph. One I'd always loved Cora at 16, sunburned and laughing into the camera, her hair wild from a full day at the lake. I'd shot it on a disposable camera, and the image was grainy and imperfect and looked exactly like what it was, a real moment caught by accident. Nadine slid it across the table. "Remember this. Your dad took this the summer you turned 16. Lucinda looked at the photograph. Her expression shifted into something warm and nostalgic. "Very convincing," Nadine said. "Genuinely impressive." She talked about the lake, the heat that summer, how her hair had been completely unmanageable that whole year. But she spoke about it the way a person describes a photograph they are currently looking at. Nadine said Cora would have said something like, "I look absolutely feral in this picture." She'd have been embarrassed. She'd have reached over and tried to flip it face down. This one admired it. Then Nadine reached across the table and took Lucinda's hand. "Are you okay, honey?" she said. "You look tired." Nadine told me that something moved across Lucinda's face in that instant. A flicker small and fast like light shifting behind a curtain. Something that might have been guilt or grief or simply the exhaustion of holding a performance together for months with no relief. For 2 full seconds, Nadine said she genuinely believed Lucinda was about to say something true. Then the phone on the table lit up. Roberta's name on the screen. Lucinda pulled her hand back, got to her feet, said she was so sorry, but she had to take this. Derek's mother had been trying to reach her, and within 90 seconds she had paid for both coffees, said her goodbyes, and was out the door. Nadine sat alone at the table. After a few minutes she drove home. She went straight to the bathroom and shut the door. She told me she sat on the tile floor with her back against the bathtub for a long time, uncertain how long exactly. She said she cried in a way she hadn't cried, since her own mother passed not from sadness alone, but from the specific devastation of certainty of knowing something that cannot be unknown. When she finally got up, she ran cold water over her wrists, dried her face, and walked out to the kitchen. She called me. I was in the truck 2 blocks from Clifford's office. "It's not her, Earl." Her voice was raw, but it held. "I know it's not her." I pulled to the curb, shifted into park, and wrapped both hands around the steering wheel until I felt the tension climb from my knuckles all the way up my forearms. Nadine. I held her hand. Her breath caught. I held her hand and looked into her eyes, and Earl, our Cora wasn't there. She wasn't there. The ache moved from my hands up through my arms and into my chest, and settled there heavy and permanent the way grief does when it has found its home. "Then where is she, Nadine?" My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Where is our Cora?" Nadine didn't answer. Neither did I. What comes next is where everything that had been building beneath the surface finally breaks through, and the people involved will never be the same. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you slowly realized someone you loved was being kept from you deliberately, would you trust your gut and act, or would you wait until you were absolutely certain? We stayed on the line together, just breathing too, people sitting with a question that had no answer. Yet only the terrible weight of finally knowing completely and without escape that the question was real. May arrived warm and quick the way it does in Tennessee. One week you're still running the heat after dark. The next, the azaleas are finished and the air carries the smell of cut grass and something sweet you can't quite place. I barely registered any of it. For 3 weeks I'd been running the same circuit through my head. A 10-year-old boy at the end of a driveway. A storage shed with a brand new padlock. A woman at our dinner table who ate eggs the wrong way and laughed with the wrong hand. I thought about the house Kofi had pointed to. Sage green siding, a wind chime on the front porch right next door to Derek and Cora's place, close enough that someone sitting at that kitchen window could hear everything happening in the yard on the other side of the fence. I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon without telling Nadine where I was headed. Not because I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to describe a plan I wasn't fully sure I had. I parked at the curb, walked up to the front door, knocked. Nothing. The wind chime turned in the breeze. Through the front window I could make out a lamp burning in the living room, the blue flicker of a television. I knocked again, waited, then walked back to my truck. I returned the next morning, at 9, or knocked twice, stepped back, tucked my hands into my pockets so I wouldn't look like a threat. The door cracked open 3 inches. A security chain pulled taut across the gap. One eye, dark and watchful, looked out at me. "I don't want trouble." Her voice was flat and certain. A woman who had spoken that sentence many times before and had meant it every single one. "Mrs. Reeves, I don't know you." The door shifted as if it was about to close. "Your son spoke to me," I said quickly. "A few weeks back out by the house next door, he told me something I haven't been able to stop turning over." The door went still. The eye behind the chain didn't move. "Kofi doesn't know anything." She said, deliberate and careful. "He knows enough," I said. "And I believe you do too." The door closed. I heard the chain slide, and for one awful moment I was certain she was locking it tighter. Then the deadbolt turned and the door came open. Celeste Reeves was 40 years old and looked like someone who worked hard and slept less than her body required. Scrubs. She'd either just come off a night shift or was heading into one. Her eyes were alert and exhausted at the same time, the combination you see in people who have learned that being tired doesn't give you the right to stop paying attention. She didn't welcome me in with any warmth. She stepped back and let me enter, and that was enough. Kofi was at the kitchen table doing homework. He looked up when I came in, recognized me right away, and shut his notebook with the measured deliberateness of a child deciding to be present for something meant for adults. Celeste sat down across from me. She didn't offer coffee. She folded her hands on the table and held me in a direct measuring gaze, the gaze of a woman who had spent her whole life navigating hard situations in difficult circumstances and had grown precise at judging which ones deserved her time. "My name is Earl Grady," I said. "The woman living next door, the one people know as Cora Fenwick. She's my daughter. Cora is my daughter." I stopped, or she was. "The woman in that house right now is not her. I have evidence she was replaced, and I don't know where my real daughter is." I kept my voice level. "I came here because I believe you've witnessed things, and I need to know what." Celeste was quiet for a moment. She looked over at Kofi. He looked back at her, and something moved between them, the wordless shorthand of two people who have weathered things side by side and know each other's signals without needing words. She turned back to me and began. "The first months after the wedding," she said, "were loud. Not celebration, loud, distress, loud. She worked night shifts at the hospital and came home around 6 in the morning, and the lights next door would still be burning, voices still going, shouting, crying. The particular sound of someone working hard to keep their crying quiet and not quite managing it. One night I came home and she was in the backyard. Celeste's voice stayed low and deliberate, each word set down carefully, like she was crossing ground she wasn't sure would hold, sitting on the ground by the fence with her arms wrapped around her knees, just sitting there. Then Roberta came outside and pulled her up and brought her in. She paused. Roberta didn't comfort her. She just retrieved her. The way you retrieve something that's gotten out of place. Kofi was watching his mother with the focused attention of a child who understands he is taking in something important. "There was a night I nearly called 911, Celeste went on. "It got loud enough that I had my phone out with the number half dialed, standing right there." She nodded toward the kitchen window. "Then I thought about what happened before. A neighbor further down the street had phoned in a domestic situation over there. By the time the officers arrived, Derek was shaking their hands and offering sweet tea, and the whole thing dissolved. Officers left smiling. She set her jaw. I'm a black single mother. Derek Fenwick has money and a contractor's license and people who owe him." I put my phone down. She looked at me straight. No apology in her expression, just the honest weight of a decision she had made and hadn't stopped carrying. "I could have called," she said. "I didn't. I have to live with that." The words found something deep and specific in me because I understood them entirely. I thought about the dinner table, the egg yolk, the song I'd hummed that she didn't recognize, all the moments I'd registered something wrong, and reached for the explanation that let me go home in peace. "You're doing it now," I said. "That's not nothing." Something shifted in Celeste's face. Not quite relief, but the slight easing of a pressure that had been there a long time. She pressed her lips together, gave one short nod, then looked over at Kofi again. The boy sat up a little straighter. He'd been waiting for this. I could see he had known from the moment I walked through that door that this part was coming. His hands lay flat on the closed notebook. His eyes met mine with the same steady quality that had stopped me in my tracks the first time I saw him standing at the end of that driveway on a March evening. "Celeste said, There's something else, something my son saw, about 3 weeks ago. I placed both hands flat on the table. I looked at Kofi Reeves, and I waited. Kofi didn't look to his mother for permission. He'd already received it. That nod at the table had been the permission, and now he simply turned to face me and began. It was a Saturday afternoon, he said. His voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of a child who had rehearsed this, not to perform it, but to be sure he got it right. I was clearing leaves in the backyard. We've got that big oak that drops things all year. Mom always wants it done on weekends. What time, I asked. Maybe 3 tomorrow. Sun was still up. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at me. I heard something coming from the shed next door through the fence. I figured it was a cat. We get strays back there, they get into everything sometimes. He paused, so I moved closer to the fence and it got louder. I made myself stay still. Every muscle I had wanted to lean forward. It wasn't a cat, Kofi said. It was scratching, like fingernails on wood. And then he swallowed. Then there was a voice. Really quiet, like somebody who hadn't used their voice in a long time, and their throat wasn't working right. He held my gaze. Help, he said. Please, is someone there? The words dropped into that kitchen like stones into still water. I felt them reach bottom. I ran and got Mom, Kofi said simply. Celeste took over her hands, pressing down against the table in front of her. I came out fast. Kofi had his hand on the fence pointing. We went to the gap. There's a broken board near the back corner you can see through if you get close. She pressed her lips together hard. There's a gap along the bottom of the shed door, maybe an inch of light getting in from somewhere. I looked through the fence and I could see that gap, and there were fingers at it. Fingernails against the wood floor. She stopped, then she looked up. My throat had closed entirely. I pressed one fist to the center of my chest and breathed. She looked up through that door gap, Celeste said, and I saw her face in that sliver of light. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and it was the same face I'd been looking at next door for months. The same face. She shook her head slowly. I grabbed Kofi, and we went inside, locked the door, shut off the lights, and we sat down on the kitchen floor because I couldn't think of what else to do. Kofi spoke again quietly. I knew it wasn't the same person. I actually knew before that. The lady who moved in, she never came out to the backyard. The one I'd seen before the real one, she used to toss a ball back over the fence when her dog got it stuck on our side. He looked at me. The dog's name was Peanut, small kind of tan-colored. I used to hear her out there calling it. After about 3 months, I never heard Peanut anymore. And the new lady never went in the backyard, not once. Peanut, Cora's dog, the one she'd gotten 2 years ago, the one she sent us photos of on holidays, the one she'd named because it was about the size of one. I looked at this 10-year-old boy who had noticed a missing dog, who had moved toward a sound instead of away from it, who had stopped 2 people at the end of a driveway because he'd made up his mind they needed to know. And I had to look away for a moment out the window at the oak tree losing its leaves in the May breeze because my eyes were burning so badly I couldn't see him clearly. Kofi, I said when I could speak again, you did the right thing. He nodded, not with any pride, just acknowledging a plain fact. I shook Celeste's hand at the door. She held it a beat longer than she needed to, and I understood that was its own kind of statement. I thanked her. She said, "Don't thank me yet." I climbed into the truck, pulled out of the neighborhood, made it 4 blocks before the light at a cross street went red, and I stopped, and it arrived all at once fully, without anything left to absorb the impact. That storage shed. The one I'd been standing 20 feet from on a March evening, hands in my pockets, looking out at the backyard, while Derek offered me coffee. The one with the new padlock and the reinforced door frame that my engineer's eye had clocked, and my father's instinct had failed to follow through on. My daughter had been inside that shed, while I stood outside and looked at it, while I went back in to finish dessert. I pulled to the curb, cut the engine, covered my face with both hands, and pressed until I could feel my own pulse in my palms. I sat like that for a long time, while traffic moved around me and the May afternoon stayed warm and ordinary and entirely indifferent. When I finally reached for my phone, my hands were shaking badly enough that I misdialed Nadine's number the first time. She picked up on the first ring. "Earl, what happened?" I told her. All of it, Celeste's voice. The scratching at the door gap, Kofi's face when he said the word help, the dog named Peanut that had simply vanished. And I told her about the shed and what I had and hadn't done when I was standing 20 feet from it back in March. Nadine didn't make a sound the whole time I spoke. When I finished the line, stayed quiet long enough that I pulled the phone away to check we were still connected. Then she spoke. Her voice was flat and clear, and already certain the voice she used when a decision had been reached and what was left was carrying it out. "Earl," she said, "we need Brent and we need Clifford tonight." They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Clifford came first, pulled up in his sedan, came through the back door the way I'd asked him to, and set his folder on the kitchen table without being told. Brent arrived 7 minutes later, still in his work clothes, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook. Clifford's hand shook mine, squeezed Nadine's shoulder. Nadine had made coffee. None of us touched it. The kitchen clock read 10:04. Outside the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. Walk me through everything Brent said, in order all of it. Clifford opened the folder. He was methodical, the way good investigators are. No drama, no commentary, just facts laid out in the sequence they mattered. He started with the signatures, 2 sheets side by side on the table, the February delivery receipt, next to the catering contract from the wedding. He walked Brent through the directional difference the letter shapes, the pen pressure. Brent leaned in, put his reading glasses on, and studied them for a solid 30 seconds without a word. Then Clifford moved to the financials. Derek Fenwick's debt profile, $400,000, spread across 2 private lenders and a commercial credit line, 17 months in default. 3 LLCs structured to obscure personal liability. Assets transferred to Roberta Fenwick's name in 2020 before the debt had fully materialized. Fraudulent conveyance, Brent said quietly, almost to himself. Transferring assets to avoid creditors. That's a separate charge if we get there. Clifford nodded. He pulled out the cosmetic surgery records, the Huntsville clinic, the cash payments, the timeline. Then the phone records metadata from Derek's secondary number, a prepaid device registered to a shell address, showing consistent contact, with a number traced back to Lucinda Pruitt, going back 18 months before the wedding. They were coordinating before Derek even approached Cora. Clifford said, the surgery, the timing, the approach, all of it mapped out in advance. Brent took his glasses off and set them on the table. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and studied the ceiling for a moment. Then, what's the weakest link in the chain? Connecting Lucinda's current identity to the surgery records, Clifford said. The clinic used a patient alias. We have strong circumstantial alignment, timing, payment method, physical description, but no signed document with her name on it. And that's manageable if we have a live witness who can place her there. Brent looked at me. Earl, you said there was something else. The shed. I told him about Kofi, the scratching sound, the voice through the gap at the bottom of the door, the face in that sliver of light. I kept it to sequence and detail the way Clifford had no embellishment, because the facts were already more than enough without it. When I finished, Brent and Clifford looked at each other across the table. It was the look of 2 men who had both sat in rooms where terrible things were confirmed, who understood exactly what this meant and who knew that whatever came next had to be chosen carefully because Nadine was sitting 2 feet away. We cannot go in ourselves, Brent said. His voice was measured and absolute. Any unauthorized entry poisons the physical evidence and hands their defense a suppression argument that could bring down the whole case. Whatever is in that shed stays untouched until law enforcement goes in with proper authority. Nadine made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound of a mother holding herself back from the only thing she wanted to do. I know, Brent said to her gently, but without backing off the point. I know. But if we do this wrong, the people responsible walk free. We do it right, they don't. Clifford leaned forward. We need someone official to move on this. A detective with no ties to Derek's network. Someone who takes it seriously and acts quickly. He looked at Brent. You mentioned you knew someone. Brent was already reaching for his phone. Imani Ashby. She's been with Nashville-Davidson PD for 18 years, the last 6 in criminal investigations. She's worked cases where people with money tried to make problems disappear. She doesn't rattle easily. He was already dialing. The call ran 11 minutes. Brent did most of the talking, laying the summary out in this precise, layered way. He'd built a career on facts, first inferences, second request at the end. We could hear Imani's voice, but not her words. Her tone was sharp and steady, the sound of someone already thinking several moves out. When Brent set the phone down, he looked at it for a moment before he looked at me. Then Clifford spoke again. There's one more thing, he said. I held it back because I wanted to be certain first. He pulled a second set of papers from the back of the folder. Roberta Fenwick. He laid it out the same way he'd laid everything else out. No rush, nothing buried. Roberta's personal phone records showing contact with Derek's prepaid number and with Lucinda Pruitt going back 2 years. A cash withdrawal from Roberta's personal account, $8,000 in a single transaction 14 months ago, matching in timing and amount with the final payment to the Huntsville clinic, and hardware store receipts pulled from a loyalty card account Roberta had used without thinking twice. Heavy-duty padlocks, door reinforcement hardware, acoustic insulation panels. Purchased 8 months ago, delivered to an address 1 block from Derek and Cora's house, then redirected. She bought soundproofing materials, Nadine said. Her voice was completely empty of inflection, which was more frightening than if she had screamed. Yes, Clifford said. The kitchen went very still. She didn't just help, Clifford said. She built this. Brent put his glasses back on and began to write. Nadine's hand found mine under the table. Her fingers were ice cold, and she gripped hard enough that my knuckles pressed together. I let her because I needed something to hold on to as well. Brent looked up. Imani will meet us tomorrow morning at my office. 8 Housewarming. He held my gaze with the directness of a man who had delivered hard news to clients for 30 years. Earl, if your daughter is in that shed, she's been there for months. We don't know what condition she's in. You need to be ready for that. The words passed through me the way something structural sounds, when it begins to fail, that low, deep groan before everything shifts. Nadine's grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. I held on. Imani Ashby arrived at Brent's office at 7:58, 2 minutes early, which told me something about her before she opened her mouth. Mid-40s, medium height, natural hair pulled back cleanly. Dark blazer over a gray shirt, detective shield clipped to her belt. Her handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who had learned that women in her position needed to establish their competence within the first 10 seconds, or spend the rest of any conversation still working to prove it. She settled across from us, opened a fresh notepad, uncapped her pen, and said, "Start from the beginning. Don't condense. I want the details." So, I gave her the details. She didn't interrupt. She wrote without stopping her pen, moving in tight, controlled lines across the page. When I mentioned the signatures, she asked to see the originals. When I got to the surgery timeline, she asked for Clifford's documentation. When I described what Kofi had witnessed and heard her pen slowed slightly, not from doubt, I understood, but from the deliberateness of someone recording something she knew mattered. When I finished, she read back through her notes for 2 full minutes. Then she looked up. "The physical evidence is strong," she said. "The signatures, the financial records, the surgery timeline, that's a coherent chain. The gap is live witness testimony, placing an individual inside the shed." She paused. "You said there's a 10-year-old boy and his mother who saw the face." "Yes," I said. "I need to speak with both of them directly." She glanced over at Brent. "And I'll need to approach the boy separately from the mother. Standard protocol for minor witnesses keeps the testimony independent, prevents any argument later that the child was coached." Brent nodded. We drove to Celeste's house in 2 cars. Imani had asked to travel separately, which I understood she needed to arrive as law enforcement, not as one of our group. Celeste opened the door before Imani knocked. She'd watched us pull up. She looked at the shield, then at Imani's face, and something in the way she was holding herself shifted. Not loosening exactly, but recalibrating. "Mrs. Reeves," Imani said, "I'm Detective Imani Ashby, Nashville Davidson PD. I'd like to speak with you about what you witnessed next door. You're not obligated to talk to me, and you can have an attorney present if you prefer. But I'm asking because what you know may be the thing that helps someone who needs it." Celeste held the door open. "Come in." Nadine and I waited in the living room, while Imani sat at the kitchen table with Celeste. I could hear Celeste's voice low, steady, growing fuller, and more certain as she went. The same account she'd given me, but with more in it now. Details she'd held back before, maybe because she hadn't believed I could do anything with them. The night she'd watched Roberta drag Cora across the back porch by the arm. The morning she found a broken plate in the yard that had cleared the fence. The 3 months of abrupt silence that had felt wrong from the first day it started. Then Imani asked Kofi to come in alone. Celeste looked at her son. He looked back at her, with those steady 10-year-old eyes, and said, "It's okay, Mom," in a tone that made Celeste press her hand over her mouth for a moment. She nodded. He went in. I sat with Celeste in the living room. She stared at the closed kitchen door, her fingers working the hem of her scrub top. "He shouldn't have to do this," she said. Her voice broke cleanly on that last word, snapping right through the middle of it the way something dry gives. He's 10 years old. He was just out there clearing leaves. He's the bravest person in this whole thing, I said. And I meant it completely. 15 minutes later, Imani came out of the kitchen. Kofi followed, crossed to the sofa, and leaned into his mother's side with the full weight of a child who has done something adult and is finished and ready to be a child again. Celeste put her arm around him without looking down, just pulled him in close. Imani stood in the doorway and looked at Celeste. Mrs. Reeves, I want to answer your question directly. You asked who protects you and your son if this goes sideways. Celeste looked up. I do, Imani said. That's not a promise I make lightly, but I make it. She held Celeste's gaze for a moment. I'll have the warrant by tomorrow morning. After she left, after the door shut and the sound of her car faded down the street, Celeste looked at me. The television was off. Kofi had gone slack against her shoulder. Eyes closed, his breathing slow, and even his face finally soft, the way children's faces go when they stop working at something. I heard her crying at night, Celeste said quietly. More than once. I told myself it wasn't my business to get into. Her jaw tightened. I'm sorry I didn't move sooner. I looked at this woman who worked nights to keep the lights on, raising her son by herself, carrying this for months, because she hadn't trusted that anyone would take her seriously. You're here now, I said. She gave one short nod and pulled Kofi a little closer. I drove home through the May evening with the windows open, the warm air moving through the truck, trying to think practically about tomorrow and finding I couldn't hold any practical thought for more than a few seconds before it slipped away. At home, Nadine was already in bed. I went to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, and lifted down the wooden box. I carried it to the table and sat beneath the single overhead light and worked the copper latch open. 28 cards. I went through them slowly, the lopsided orange cat, the bicycle, the guitar, all those years of Cora rendered in pencil and crayon and ballpoint pen. When I reached the last one, the 28th, I held it in both hands and looked at the two hands I'd drawn stretching toward each other from opposite edges of the card. Then I closed the box, set it back in the cabinet, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. Tomorrow we would go get our daughter. Celeste's voice came through steady and low, growing surer as she talked. Everything she'd shared with me before, but with flesh on it, now the pieces she'd held back, uncertain they'd be of any use. The evening she'd watched Roberta wrench Cora across the back porch by the arm. The morning a shattered plate had turned up in the yard, thrown clear of the fence. The 3 months of silence that had settled over that house and felt wrong every single day of it. Then Imani asked Kofi to step into the kitchen by himself. Celeste turned to look at her boy. He met her eyes with that calm that 10-year-olds sometimes have when they've already made their decision, and he said, "It's okay, Mom." The steadiness in it made Celeste lift her hand to cover her mouth. She nodded. He went in. I stayed in the living room with Celeste. Her gaze was fixed on the kitchen door fingers, twisting the hem of her scrub top, without her seeming to notice. "He shouldn't have to do this," she said, and the final word fractured, cracking down the center the way a dry stick does. "He's 10 years old. He was out there minding the leaves. He's the bravest one in this whole thing," I told her, and not a word of it was hollow. 15 minutes went by. Imani came back through the door. Kofi trailed after her, dropped down beside his mother, and pressed his whole body into her side, the particular weight of a child who's carried something too big and is finally ready to put it down. Celeste drew him in without glancing his way, arm pulling him close automatically. Imani stood at the doorway and held Celeste's gaze. "Mrs. Reeves, I want to answer your question directly. You asked, who protects you and your son if this goes wrong?" Celeste looked up. "I do," Imani said. "I don't say that carelessly, but I mean it." A beat passed between them. "I'll have the warrant by tomorrow morning." Once she was gone, door shut, engine note. Fading until it disappeared, Celeste looked over at me. No television. Kofi had gone slack against her shoulder, breathing deep, and even his face carrying the looseness that only arrives in children when they've finally stopped holding on to something. "I heard her crying at night," Celeste said, and not just once. I kept telling myself to stay out of it. A muscle in her jaw went hard. "I'm sorry I waited so long." I sat there looking at her, this woman pulling night shifts to pay the bills, raising her son without help, holding all of this inside for months, because nobody had given her reason to believe they'd hear her. "You're here now," I said. One nod. She gathered Kofi a little tighter. The drive home was through a warm May evening windows, open air moving through the cab of the truck. I made myself think about the next morning and kept losing it, every practical thought dissolving almost the moment it formed. Nadine was already asleep when I got in. I went straight to the kitchen, pulled open the cabinet over the refrigerator, and brought down the wooden box. Set it on the table under the overhead light. Sat down. Opened the latch. 28 cards. I looked at them one by one. The orange cat, the bicycle, the guitar, all those years of Cora pencil and crayon and ballpoint pen. The last card number, 28, I held in both hands for a while. 2 hands I'd drawn reaching from opposite edges toward each other. Then I latched the box, slid it back into the cabinet, killed the kitchen light, and climbed the stairs. Tomorrow, we were going to bring our daughter home. The flashlight carved a pale wedge across the far left corner of the shed. That's where I saw her, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest. What she was wearing had once been a blouse gray, now shapeless, thrown over 2 more shirts that showed themselves at the collar. Her hair had gone the way it goes, without proper washing, matted dull, the color of neglect. Her face, and I mean her face, the one I'd been looking at for 28 years, had been pared down to something frightening. The sharpness of a person kept at the edge of enough and no further. Cheekbones pushing at the surface of her skin. Wrists exposed where the cuffs had ridden up, barely wider than a child's. Peanut was tucked against her hip. Head-raised, ears pitched forward, making a sound caught somewhere between a bark and a whimper. The sound of an animal running on nothing but instinct, with almost nothing left to run on. Cora looked up. The way she looked at me, it was the look of someone who has disciplined themselves out of expecting anything, who holds very still at moments like this, waiting to find out where it breaks. Her eyes moved across my face the way you'd check something you weren't sure of yet. I watched her doing it, my throat sealed. I couldn't have made a sound. I crossed to her and went down on both knees on the concrete floor. Didn't think about the cold, didn't feel it. "Cora," I said. My voice came out in pieces. "It's Dad! I'm here." Something shifted behind her eyes. Whatever she'd been bracing against let go. Her chin dipped, her shoulders began to shake. What came out of her wasn't quite crying. It was the sound that comes from something that's been locked rigid for too long, and the unlocking is almost violent. Her hands rested in her lap. I watched the right one open, fingers spreading slowly, and there in her palm lay a small folded square of paper, crumpled, discolored, aged to the yellow of old documents, the fold lines worn to velvet from being handled. I knew what it was before I got close enough to read it. I had written it myself in my own hand with a Sharpie on a piece of notepaper from the kitchen drawer the night before her wedding. I'd tucked it into the interior pocket of her dress bag while she was in the shower, meaning for her to find it later, or not at all, whichever she needed. "Dad's always here." She had kept that note for 19 weeks inside a bolted shed with no heat, 1 meal a day when he bothered. She'd kept it pressed against her skin, folded inside the lining of her shirt, where it never occurred to anyone to search. My own shoulders were moving before I registered it happening. I put both hands over my eyes bent at the waist and felt my chest heave with everything that had been stored up since October, with nowhere to go. Then her hand rose. I could see the bones beneath the skin, the fingernails worn to nothing, from 19 weeks of scratching marks into wood, and it came down on my shoulder, gentle as paper settling. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Her voice had been reduced to ruins, raw and fractured. It was the voice of someone who'd had no reason to use it for months except to call out to silence. I kept counting. "I knew you were counting too." I wrapped my arms around her with the care you'd give something fragile. She came toward me, and I felt what was left of her, and whatever had still been holding in my chest gave way entirely. Peanut got to his feet, unsteady legs trembling under a body that had given most of itself away. He pressed his small head against my knee and held it there. Time passed, I couldn't have said how much. Gradually, I felt Nadine behind me there in the doorway. She'd come in without a sound. She was standing at the threshold with one hand braced flat against the door frame, and she was looking at her daughter on the floor of that shed, and her face did something I had never seen it do in 40 years of marriage. Everything in it gave out at once. Every muscle releasing together, grief and relief, slamming into each other at the exact same instant, each one undoing the other. "Mom." Cora's voice fractured on that single syllable. Nadine crossed the floor in 4 steps and came down beside us. She took Cora's face between her palms the way she used to when Cora was running a fever as a small child and needed someone to really look at her. And she said, "I've got you. I've got you, I've got you. 3 times, like a thing that has to be said, 3 times to become real. Cora gave us what she knew in fragments while we sat there, waiting out of sequence, surfacing the way things do when a dam finally gives. 19 weeks. She'd calculated it herself, scratching a line into the wood beside the door each morning, as the light shifted 1 mark each day grouped in sevens, the oldest accounting method there is. When they found her, 19 full groups and 4 solitary marks beyond that. 137 days. Derek came once daily with food, whatever hadn't been finished at dinner, and sometimes not even that. Some nights Peanut nudged his bowl in her direction. She said it the way you state a fact you've already settled inside yourself. And I had to turn and study the wall of the shed to hold my expression. Winter nearly broke her. No heat at all, just whatever she could pull from the drop cloths and rags piled in the corner. Roberta showed up once a week and spoke to her through the door, the way you'd chat with a neighbor over a garden fence. She was never angry, Cora said. That was the piece I couldn't get out of my head. I thought about Roberta standing in the doorway that morning, those flat creek water eyes fixed on me across the yard, the composure with which she'd told Derek not to speak. The note Cora said she'd found it in her dress bag that first morning, tucked in the interior pocket, which she only reached because she was cold and trying to add another layer. She unfolded it in the dark, couldn't make out the words, held it until enough light came through the door gap to read them. After that, she kept it folded inside the lining of her bra. Every night she'd take it out and hold it, not because it promised anything, just because it was proof that she had existed to someone before any of this started, that there had been a version of her before that shed, that someone had cared enough to write 4 words on a scrap of paper and hide them somewhere she'd find them when she needed them most. The ambulance pulled up out front. We heard the doors, the radio, the clipped professional voices. 2 paramedics came through the back with a stretcher. Cora looked at them, then at me, the way a person looks when they've kept themselves alive by trusting nothing and are now being asked to start again. I've got you, I said. We're right here. She let them lift her. Peanut moved to follow, and one of the paramedics scooped him up, without a word tucked him under one arm and carried him along. Cora watched it happen, and something in her face eased for the first time. We moved back through the house, through the back door, through the kitchen, out the front. On the lawn, Derek stood with his wrists zip-tied behind him, a uniformed officer at his side. Roberta stood near the cruiser spine, straight, her robe pulled around her like armor, watching us approach with those flat eyes. Lucinda was sitting on the front steps with her elbows on her knees and her face aimed at the ground. She didn't look up as we passed. Derek looked at the stretcher, at Cora on it. Something crossed his face, not remorse, nothing that honest, more like a recalibration. The look of a man already revising his next argument. He looked at me then. I held it for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to confirm there was nothing there I needed. Then I turned back to my daughter and put my hand over hers and walked beside her to the ambulance. The plastic chair outside Cora's room had been engineered. It seemed against comfort, hard, slightly too narrow, the armrests at the exact wrong height. I'd been in it 40 minutes and felt all of it in my lower back and hadn't shifted once. Nadine sat next to me with her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the closed door. The hallway carried the smell of antiseptic and the particular recycled air you only find in hospitals, the smell that signals someone is being sustained by systems rather than their own momentum. A cart rattled past down the corridor. A phone rang at the nurse's station. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning that had no business being in the same world as what was happening behind that door. The clock on the wall read 9:17 when Imani came around the corner. She moved the way she always did, deliberate, unhurried, occupying exactly the space required, and nothing extra. She pulled a chair from the wall and sat down facing us without any preamble. Derek and Roberta are in custody, she said. Processing is underway. Roberta invoked her right to counsel immediately. Not a single word before the attorney arrived. Not a flicker. She paused. Derek did the same, by the book both of them. Nadine's jaw went tight, and Imani's expression shifted. Not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. Different story. She sat down at the table in the interview room, folded her hands and said, "I knew you'd come. I just didn't know it was today." Imani looked at me. "She's already asked to speak with the DA's office. She wants a deal. She'll get a lighter sentence for cooperating." I said, not with bitterness, just putting the fact out loud to hear how it landed. "Almost certainly," Imani said. "But what she gives us in exchange carries more weight than what she walks away with." Her testimony corroborates the physical evidence and locks in the conspiracy timeline. Derek's attorneys won't be able to unwind that. My phone buzzed. Brent. I moved a few steps down the hall and answered. He walked me through the charges in that measured, precise way of his unlawful imprisonment, wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud obtaining property by deception. Roberta faced all of those plus a separate count of aiding and abetting, and depending on what Lucinda's cooperation produced, potentially further charges tied to the planning and preparation. The soundproofing materials, Brent said, Roberta purchasing those is significant. It establishes premeditation, active involvement in the confinement itself, not just the financial fraud. That distinction matters at sentencing. What about the money, I asked. A pause. Clifford has been working the accounts. Derek moved funds heavily over the past several months, offshore structures, layered transfers. We'll pursue civil recovery through the fraud charges, but I want to be straight with you, Earl. Realistically, you're looking at partial recovery, not all of it. I stood in that hospital hallway and thought about 15 years of $20 bills in a kitchen drawer. I thought about the check I'd signed with my own hand at the closing table. Okay, I said. I'm sorry, Brent said. I know that isn't what you were hoping for. It's not the part that matters right now, I told him, and meant it, and walked back to sit beside Nadine. Imani was still there. She had her notepad out reviewing something. But there's one more thing, she said without looking up. When we walked Roberta to the cruiser this morning, she stopped. She turned and looked back at the house. I thought she was about to say something. Look for Derek, look for Lucinda, something human. Imani set the pen down. She looked at the shed, just the shed for about 4 seconds. Then she got in the car. The hallway felt colder than it had a moment before. Nadine said very quietly, "What does that mean?" It means, Imani said, that to Roberta Fenwick, what happened in that shed wasn't a regrettable necessity. It was something she designed, something she seemed to weigh the next word carefully, satisfied with. Neither of us had anything to say to that. Some things have no answer worth giving. Imani stood and tucked the notepad away. One more thing from Lucinda's preliminary statement. She said Roberta handled the logistics. Lucinda wasn't told about the soundproofing, the modifications made to the interior of the shed. She said she didn't know Roberta had been making weekly visits to speak to your daughter. She visited Cora. Nadine's voice had gone flat and hollowed out the tone of someone who has run out of space for more horror. Once a week, according to Lucinda's account. When Lucinda learned about it this morning in the interview room, she stopped talking for nearly 2 minutes. Imani looked at me steadily. Then she said, "I thought we were just taking money. I didn't know she was enjoying it." Something moved through me I couldn't name, not anger. I was past the temperature where anger burns. Something colder, more permanent. The understanding that Roberta Fenwick hadn't simply agreed to a scheme. She had built one, and in the carrying out of it, she had found something that fed her. Imani left. Nadine and I sat with that for a while. At 9:51, the door to Cora's room swung open. A doctor in green scrubs came out pulling her mask down. She was young, younger than Cora, I thought, and she wore the careful look of someone who needs you to receive what they're about to say accurately. I was on my feet before she got a word out. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Malnourished and dehydrated, electrolytes significantly off. We're correcting that now. She'll need monitoring and nutritional support over the next several days, and we want to keep her for observation." She paused. "But she's alert and oriented, and her vitals are responding well." A smaller pause. "She's asking for you." Nadine made a sound beside me, relief coming loose all at once. The way a breath held too long releases uncontrolled and total. She brought both hands to her mouth. I nodded at the doctor, pushed open the door, and walked in. By afternoon, the light through the hospital window had turned gold and horizontal, the specific quality of a May evening in Tennessee, the kind that makes everything look briefly as though it has been forgiven. Cora had the bed cranked up, so she was half sitting. An IV line ran into her left arm, clear fluid moving steadily through it. Peanut Nadine had asked someone had made a call, and a vet from a clinic 2 blocks away had come and looked him over, and declared him severely underweight, but otherwise intact, was curled at the foot of the bed, in the exact position he had always preferred, nose tucked under his tail. Nadine stood near the window, with her arms loosely crossed, not speaking, just present in the room, which was what Cora needed more than any conversation right now. I sat in the chair beside the bed, with my hand resting over Cora's. Her fingers were cold. The nails were worn down to the quick, several of them torn, rather than clipped, and I understood what that meant and kept myself from revisiting the shed walls in my mind. She spoke in the unhurried, almost detached manner of someone telling a story they have rehearsed inside themselves. So many times it's been smoothed of its sharpest edges. Not because it had stopped hurting. I could see it hurting in the way her jaw clamped down on certain words, in the way she'd pause and find her way back. But she had spent 19 weeks living inside this story. She knew its geography. The first night she said she came to, in complete darkness, with her head splitting and her mouth carrying some chemical aftertaste. She had no idea where she was. The first word out of her mouth was Peanut's name, because it was the one that surfaced first. He came out of the dark to her, and she grabbed hold and didn't let go. That was the first thing she was certain of after waking. He was there. She wasn't entirely alone. He never used my name, she said. Derek, not once in 137 days. It was always you or nothing. Her voice didn't waver. I think that was deliberate. Once you stop using someone's name, you stop having to see them as a person. It gets easier, she said. Derek had talked early on about getting rid of Peanut. Roberta said no. A dog scratching at a fence or barking for its owner draws more attention than one that simply vanishes inside a shed. It was the most useful thing Roberta ever did for either of them. I pressed my hand down harder over hers. She let me. Roberta came every week, every Thursday. I flinched when she said Thursday and she noticed. I know, she said quietly. I counted those too. Roberta would bring a folding chair and sit outside the shed door and talk through the wood, conversationally, pleasantly, like a neighbor chatting over a fence. Told Cora that Earl and Nadine had moved on, that they'd accepted her absence, that they were actually relieved not to have the worry anymore, that the money was being put to good use, that some people simply weren't suited to the lives they'd been born into, and that Cora ought to try to see this as a correction rather than a cruelty. She believed it. Cora said that's what I kept coming back to in the dark. She wasn't trying to cause pain. She genuinely believed she was explaining something true. She looked at the IV line. That frightened me more than Derek ever did. When Cora mentioned the nights Peanut pushed his food bowl toward her, I looked away toward the window. The golden light was still out there, indifferent and beautiful. I heard Nadine shift behind me and knew without turning that she'd done the same. The note Cora said she found it that first morning, shaking with cold, going through everything in the shed, searching for something to put on. It was in the pocket of her dress bag, the bag they'd tossed in with her, most likely without even glancing at it. She unfolded it in the dark and couldn't see it. She held it until the line of light at the bottom of the door grew bright enough to read by. I read it every night after that, she said. Not because I was sure you'd come. She looked straight at me, and her eyes had the clarity that comes after everything has already been cried out. But to remember who I was before all of this. There was a version of me that someone thought was worth 4 words on a piece of paper. I needed to keep knowing that. I couldn't find any words for a moment. I looked at our hands on the blanket, her thin, broken fingers beneath my old ones. Dad, her voice shifted register. Did you draw my card this year? I understood immediately. Her 29th birthday had come and gone while she was inside that shed. I hadn't known it was passing. I hadn't drawn anything. Not yet, I said. She nodded once, and the corners of her mouth moved in a shape that wasn't quite a smile, but was the outline one would take if it arrived. Okay, she said, the one word. The weight of it was enormous and gentle at the same time, forgiveness given without being asked for, which is the only kind that carries any real weight. She turned toward the window. The light was fading, the gold going to rose. What happens to them, she asked. I told her Brent was handling it. Lucinda had already given a statement. The charges were serious. The evidence was strong. She listened. Then I don't need to see them punished, Dad. I just need to know they can't do this to anyone else. I looked at my daughter, not the young woman from the house. Warming spinning through those rooms with that enormous laugh. Not the person I'd been afraid I might have lost for good. Someone between those two, finding the path that connected them, moving along it, one careful step at a time. Peanut lifted his head from the foot of the bed, looked at Cora, then settled it back down. Outside, the Tennessee evening came in. 18 months is a long time. Long enough for the azaleas to come back twice, for the tomatoes I put in along the south fence to produce 2 full seasons, for the wood on the back porch steps to need replacing. Long enough for a good many things to change their shape. I'm sitting on the porch now, with my coffee gone cold in my hand, looking at the garden and thinking about how to tell what came after. Derek Fenwick accepted a plea agreement in October 2023. 12 years, no early release consideration for the first 8. Roberta Fenwick went to trial and was convicted on all counts: unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, aiding and abetting, and received 8 years. The judge noted at sentencing that the evidence of premeditation and active participation made leniency inappropriate. Roberta received the sentence without visible reaction. The court reporter noted she did not speak, did not flinch, and did not look at Cora, who sat in the third row with Nadine's hand in hers. Lucinda Pruitt cooperated fully. Probation, restitution, and 5 years of supervised release. Whether that was just is not something I've spent much energy deciding. What she handed the prosecution made the case airtight. That's what I know. The money, most of it is gone. Brent recovered a portion through civil litigation against Derek's remaining domestic assets. Enough to matter, not enough to replace 15 years of careful saving. I've made peace with that, the way you make peace with something that costs more than it should have and can't be put back. You just stop doing the math. Cora came home from the hospital after 3 weeks. She moved back into her old room. Nadine had never changed it. I understood then that this wasn't sentiment, it was foresight. The particular knowing of a mother who'd kept a door open because some part of her had always believed it might need to be walked back through. The first weeks were quiet. Cora slept a great deal, the deep, exhausted sleep of a body rebuilding itself from the inside. She sat in the window seat in her room for long stretches, not reading, not reaching for her phone, just watching the backyard. Peanut planted himself directly on top of her feet, wherever she settled, as though his purpose was to make sure she didn't disappear again. And maybe it was. Nadine didn't push. She cooked, really cooked. The full Sunday dinners, the weeknight soups, the homemade blackberry pie that had sat untouched at the housewarming. She left doors open. She sat near Cora without asking anything of her, just present the way good teachers know, how to be present filling a room without demanding to be acknowledged. Somewhere in the second month, Cora began talking more. Not about what had happened, that came gradually in fragments, mostly to a therapist she saw twice a week, in a small office on Granny White Pike, but other things. Opinions on shows she was watching. Memories that rose to the surface and needed to be spoken aloud. The evening she told us about a disastrous group project from her sophomore year of college and laughed. Really laughed, that big unguarded laugh she'd gotten from Nadine. I had to get up to refill my water glass and stand in the kitchen alone for a minute. Her 29th birthday fell on a Thursday in July. I gave her the card after dinner. I'd worked on it over 3 evenings. Not the cat, not the guitar, none of the things tied to specific years. Just a door drawn in pencil, plain and simple, slightly ajar, with light coming through from the other side. No words inside. I hadn't known what to write, and I decided that was all right. The drawing was enough. Cora held it in both hands for a long moment. She considered it the way she used to approach a difficult problem, taking her time, not rushing it, giving the thing its due. Then her eyes came up to meet mine. There was brightness in them, but no tears. A single nod passed between us. It was enough. Come August, we loaded up and headed to Celeste Reeves's house with food, Nadine's homemade blackberry pie, a pot of chili, the kind of gesture that knows better than to try matching itself to what it owes. Kofi answered the door and immediately looked past us, scanning the porch. "Did you bring Peanut?" Cora moved out from behind me, and there he was, on his leash, restored solid coat, full eyes sharp. The dog version of a man who's been eating well for 6 months and has every intention of continuing. Kofi went straight down to the porch floor. Peanut piled into his lap. The reunion was loud and complete, and the adults attempted conversation somewhere above it. Across the porch, Celeste looked at Cora. It was a long look, measured and careful, the look of someone who has been carrying a worry for a long time and is now slowly setting it down. Then her eyes shifted to me. "How is she?" she said, keeping her voice low. "I mean, really? She's working her way back," I told her. "Not at the same pace every day." Celeste gave a slow nod. She didn't need the rest explained. She'd been on her own version of that road for a while. Cora got her own place in January 2024. A small apartment, 2nd floor, morning light through the east-facing windows. She's taken on design work again, projects with flexible hours, the kind that give her room to rebuild before she takes on more. The painting has been mostly quiet, but 3 weeks ago, a photo arrived on my phone. A canvas she'd been working on, colors unresolved composition, still finding itself edges rough. No caption, no explanation, just the image. I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote back, "I like it." 1 thumbs up came back. Nothing else. That is exactly Cora, and it was the best message I'd gotten in months. Why do I tell any of this? Not to ask something of whoever is listening. I tell it because I am a father who came within 20 ft of a locked shed, turned and left. And that will be with me until I'm gone. But I am also a father who went down on his knees on a cold concrete floor and saw his daughter unclose her hand. And there in her palm was a scrap of paper he'd written years before, and stopped thinking about one she had carried tucked against her skin for 137 days because it kept telling her who she was. 5 things I understand now that I didn't before. Loving someone completely is not the same as paying attention. I loved my daughter without question, and for months I looked away from what was being done to her, because the other explanations were easier to hold. Children see the things adults choose to unsee. A boy of 10 stopped me in a driveway and handed me the truth. I nearly let it go. People stay silent not from cowardice, but from the certainty that no one will hear them. Celeste Reeves knew everything. Courage wasn't what she lacked. What she needed was one person to stand at her door and mean it when they said, "I believe you." The people worth fearing most are not the ones who come apart. They are the ones who never do. And the last, my daughter kept a folded square of paper pressed to her body for 19 weeks. Not from certainty that I was on my way, but because those 4 words gave her back herself, the self that had existed before any of this. Sometimes the smallest thing is sufficient, a reminder that you are still here. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly, this kind of story asks something of the people who listen to it. I've thought a long time about what this cost and what it gave back. A father who missed the signs for months, not from indifference, but from the very human habit of believing what we need to believe. A mother who kept a room unchanged because something in her refused to close the door. A daughter who survived 137 days in a locked shed, holding on to 4 words written on a scrap of paper. I believe God puts small things in our hands exactly when we'll need them, and sometimes the smallest thing is what carries us through the longest night. For anyone watching who is over 50 who has loved a child and feared for them, or who has ever doubted what their own eyes were telling them, this family revenge story is for you. These are the stories that remind us what it means to keep showing up for the people we love no matter what it costs. That's what adults 50 plus understand in a way that's hard to put into words. Love is a long practice, not a single moment. 3 things I'd want you to carry with you. Pay attention even when the explanation feels easier. Love without attention can miss what's right in front of it. If a child tells you something is wrong, stop and listen. They see what we train ourselves not to. When someone hesitates to speak, make it safe. What they need is not always courage. Sometimes it's just one person willing to say, "I believe you." If this story moved you, leave a comment below. I read everyone. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.